Here's a quick overview of fantasy. We know that there are many genres of literature and that each has different characteristics. Some of the elements of fantasy are as follows. Events occur outside the ordinary laws that operate within the universe. So, for example, in real life, we've got, the law of gravity and people don't fly. In a fantasy story, there might be people that can fly or that can do things that we can't normally do because of just the regular, ordinary laws of nature. Magic is often central to the fantasy genre. Fantasy stories often involve journeys and quests, a character who has to go do something, and there's often a theme of good versus evil. The setting of fantasy stories is often set in natural, primitive, medieval surroundings, not necessarily a defined time period, although it might feel like it was a long time ago. It's not historical, right? But it's more of sort of this general fairy tale kind of feel. There are often unusual circumstances that are magical, but they're not scientifically explained. So if someone can fly, for example, it's because there's magic in fantasy, not that they were genetically engineered or something like that. There are usually specific rules or guidelines for how the magic works, but there's not often an explanation for why there's magic in the first place. And then technology and architecture are generally primitive, about the level of a blacksmith, nothing overly advanced, which makes the magical abilities of whatever characters can do things that are different, all the more contrasted from most people. When we're thinking about the characters in a fantasy story, humans in fantasy literature are often surrounded or accompanied by mythical or superhuman characters. So you might see witches and wizards, elves, fairies, dragons, goblins, trolls, talking animals where they're anthropomorphized so they can act like people. There are 3 different ways that fantasy writers set up their worlds for a fantasy book. I have been to several author interviews, but one with Sarah Dessen, she was talking about how much she admires the writers of fantasy because they really have to create a world and then figure out the rules of that universe, the rules that govern that world, and it's such a complicated thing. But that said, there are different ways that they do this. So some novels begin and end in a fantasy world. For example, The Hobbit, The Girl of Fire and Thorns. Others start in the real world and then move into a fantasy world, like Alice in Wonderland, where she's just a normal girl and then falls into a rabbit hole and suddenly everything's crazy, right? Or Peter Pan, where Wendy is living in regular England and then goes to Neverland. And the third type of fantasy is set in the real world, but elements of magic intrude in upon it. So if you have read or seen the movies for Inkheart or City of Bones, there's a lot of real world elements, but then magical things come into play. So how does fantasy differ from science fiction and fairy tales? Often science fiction and fantasy novels are grouped together in libraries and things like that because they share a lot of similar attributes. But there are a few subtle differences. So science fiction stories also operate outside the normal boundaries of the human world. Things happen that don't happen in real life, but they're usually set in the future as opposed to this sort of medieval setting, and they involve the wonders of technology as opposed to magic. So it's usually a scientific explanation for why people are able to do certain things as opposed to, oh, it's just magic. Fairy tales are also similar in feel to a fantasy story. Just the idea is they're often shorter than most fantasy works. Characters and settings often lack specificity. They're not as fleshed out as they would be in a full fantasy story. Seldom are place names given or detailed descriptions of characters in fairy tales. And then I will just give you a chance to pause and look through the examples here at your leisure. Obviously, there are many, many more than this, but these are just some samples of books that are popular for middle schoolers.